The Industrial Revolution began in 1532, and in today's audio-visual experience, I will be prolegoming industry in this Minecraft world. In the previous episode, human civilization was recreated on top of this abandoned society, shortly followed by advanced tree calculus and professional mining to support fabricating multitudinous articles, all to prepare for today's disastrous revolution. Here's what I possess as of now. 1 electrical generator donut, a massive stash of natural resources, and several powered machines, which will assist me in creating even more material parts for machine parts for more machines. But what exactly is the goal of all of this? Today's gaming agenda consists of inaugurating the blast furnace, which is the furnace but convalescent, and is also the only way to smelt aluminum, necessitated to reach the next tier of machines, which is required to unlock gaming. Before that, however, some people have requested the acquisition of the modified textures depicted in this audio-visual content. So the texture pack has been linked in the description. With that out of the way, there was a problematic problem with the factory. According to theoretical and realistic predictions, the generator donut is too inadequate for future purposes. What I really needed was a boiler and turbine setup, before the Industrial Revolution could begin. This shall be done simply by duplicating this donut into a triple donut system, connected with the pipes I made from episode 1. The way it works is that the first donut drinks water from this Amazon box and burns cane from this cursed sand farm to initiate a phase change into gaseous steam to be channeled into 2 donuts that drink the steam to spin the turbine object not depicted in game to create energy, leading to a noctuple energy increase. With that out of the way, it was time to check the quest book to foresee the next industrial goals. As it turns out, everything was needing attention. There were overwhelming quantities of new upgrades, new machines, and new materials to be obtained. But one thing at a time. The current machines had heartbreakingly low amounts of input and output slots. To amend this issue, I shall concoctify storage boxes and connect them to the machines using item pipes, with the top box leading into the input, and the bottom box storing the output. With this, the machine technically now had around 100 slots of input and output. But why stop there? I was rich enough to create even more machines to carry out any possible type of industrial task, ranging from cutting to melting to freezing to fabricating to magnetic long roading. All of which are required. So I grabbed a bunch of random materials, put them in the material processors, and used the products to make massive amounts of machine parts at once, which will be used to make new machine parts but more annoying. Which included pumps and pistons for machines that dealt with fluids. Which included the electrolyzer for using electricity to discombobulate matter into constituents. It can transform crushed clay into blah 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 and aluminum, which I obtained into my hands. Other notable machines include the fluid extractor aka melter and autoclave aka the jacketed rectangular chamber with high pressure, both of which can liquefy metals and infuse it into other objects to create shiny beautiful object. I then took this shiny object and clobbered it with some other stuff to create a vacuum cleaner. The current sugar cane farm had absolutely no collection system. But this vacuum system will swallow all cane in the multiverse, which will be transported into the generator with pipes. I then created some new material processors including the cutting saw and the macerator, which is a fancy way of saying crusher, which made even more hand tools useless. But why go through all of these different machines, when I could simply melt metals and cast them into any shape I desired? This would be done with a combination of just 2 machines known as the fluid extractor and fluid solidifier, which casted several advanced machine parts in one step, saving approximately 100 years of manual labor. But all of this paled in comparison in terms of usefulness, to the outstandingly indispensable alloy smelter, which will be needed constantly throughout the entire game to fabricate basic alloys and create never-ending arbitrarily conceived combinations of metals imagined by the developers. Not only could it conjugate coal and iron into steel without using the overwhelmingly slow primitive blast furnace, it was the only way to create cupro-nickel, bronze, and tin alloys, which are the three alloys needed to create the infamous orange coils, the main part of the upcoming modern electric blast furnace 2.0 revamped TBF GregTech. While the alloys were being cooked, the motors and pistons were consumed to recreate robotics, which were then sacrificed to create the second most outstandingly indispensable object of industrialization: the assembler. Used to assemble advanced objects whenever the measly crafting table and human hands aren't powerful enough to make stuff. Which applied to 95% of everything in this mod pack, including the blast furnace coils. The assembler also consumed molten liquids, meaning I would also need a melter next to it too. By melting tin alloys to be injected into other alloys inside the assembler, it started glowing ominously before engendering one item needed for the blast furnace. Out of about 8. This included approximately 10 voltage machine hulls made from steel mass-produced in the alloys melter and tin wires and wrought iron to be transformed into various multi-block components such as input buses and output buses, right, and input hatches and output hatches for fluid, and the maintenance hatch needing every single tool and systems, and the muffler hatch made from annoying rotors and some fluid pipes, and the blast furnace controller itself made from similar circuits. With that out of the way, I could begin building my masterpiece. But first, a bit of an explanation. Every machine so far has been one single block. But later on there shall be multi-blocks, which are conglomerations of several different blocks that work together to form a single machine that does stuff. And the blast furnace is one of them. The coils allow it to reach certain temperatures to cook stuff that is uncookable in a furnace, depending on what material is used. The muffler hatch allows it to become a volcano. The input and output buses can then be put nearly anywhere to take stuff in and out. And due to the realisticity of GregTech, there would have to be monthly maintenance or something, done with the maintenance hatch. The thing that powers it all is the energy hatch, and everything is united by blast furnace controller. However, due to the massive voltage costs, I had to use the remaining space in the multi-block to stuff as many energy hatches possible, and put all the other hatches somewhere random. With that, the glorious blast furnace was formed. The last thing to do was to plug it in and throw in some aluminum dust to cook. And it activated for approximately 1 decisecond, before it ran out of energy. This was impossible. But maybe, it was possible. I went into the testing world and did some gaming experiments. That was when I realized I needed cables with hexacuple aka quadruple thickness rather than my measly quadruple amperage cables. So I used a painstaking amount of tin to create these humorously humongous tin cables, which I wired all over the base. Therefore, according to theoretical calculations, the blast furnace should work now. It didn't. This was impossible. But maybe, it was impossible. This is impossible. I then resorted to Nuclear Strategy Plan Top Secret Plan 56B. I destroyed the energy storage and relocated it right next to the blast furnace, which magically made it work. I was about to get mad at how maddening the realistic GregTech electrical system was. But I couldn't. Due to the sight of the active blast furnace, combined with the perfectly timed thunderstorm and the thematically fitting tone of the overly dramatic music currently playing, all of which struck me with awe. The industrialization, the revolution, the kilobash glowy shader, all of it combined together made me stand still in an uncontrollably overdramatic way. And in the end, there were 4 glorious aluminum ingots. But after that was done smelting, I was back to being mad at how maddening the electrical system was. I spent 5 seconds theorizing about why the blast furnace only turned on when the power source was practically inside the furnace, before I came to the conclusion that the realistic electrical laws of GregTech was destroying ridiculous amounts of energy for each block it traveled, leading to the blast furnace catastrophically ceasing operations rapidly when it was more than 3 millimeters away from the power source. However, there was a better alternative to cables this whole time. Superconductors. For those of you who do not know, which includes me, a superconductor has no electrical loss, meaning it doesn't matter how far apart the power source and power consumers are, making it infinitely times better than the pathetic tin cables. And the only available superconductor right now are the laughably cheap conductive iron wires, which don't have to be insulated either. Anyways, this meant that all the old cables were wasted. Or were they? After I used the electrolyzer to obtain some more aluminum from clay, I began using it to separate water into hydrogen and oxygen. The oxygen was then pumped into the arc furnace, aka this, which will cook the tin cables back into the original tin ingots. But since I had a functioning blast furnace, what now? Compared to the overwhelming tasks to do at the beginning of this episode, I now had even overwhelminger amounts of tasks that just got unlocked. Which includes ascending to the next tier of technology, aka medium voltage. Rather than machines being made out of basic circuits and steel parts, medium voltage machines will need medium voltage circuits and aluminum parts. This plot twist necessitates two new things. First is automatic aluminum production, which needs 10 different things. The second thing is 10 different things to make advanced circuits. So here's what I am going to do. The main difference between the first and second tier of circuits is that it needs gallium and arsenic. To get these, it was time to do realistic ore processing. In GregTech, smelting an ore is not the only way to deal with ores. Because as it turns out, they can be crushed and washed and centrifuged and bathed and electrolyzed and stuck with refrigerator magnets to get all sorts of ore byproducts, which is where arsenic and gallium is observed. Arsenic is obtained from separating something called realgar, and gallium comes from electrolyzing sphalerite. Once they are mixed, they are thrown together with other basic materials to make diodes. But that was the easy part. The scrumptious phenolic substrate was also required, which needed this monstrosity. A blast furnace multi-block but rotated on the x-axis, aka the pyrolyze oven. But do not fear. All I had to do was create a low-voltage machine hubs made from steel mass-produced in the alloy smelter and tin wires and wrought iron to be transformed into various multi-block components such as input buses and output buses for writings and input hatches for fluids and the maintenance hatch needing every single tool and systems and a muffler hatch made from annoying rotors and some fluid pipes and the blast furnace controller itself made from similar circuits. The only big difference is that the pyrolyze oven also needs steam, which is obtained easily from dumping water into a fluid heater, which I connected to the input hatch of the oven. Anyways, the main purpose of the oven is it cooks natural objects such as wood and coal and geodesic polarine. When coal is sacrificed to the oven briefly becomes a giant thermonuclear bomb, before spitting out coke, but more importantly, phenol. Which will be dumped into my new chemical reactor to create oddly satisfying sound effects and convert normal circuit boards into real circuits boards. I was half expecting there to be yet another ridiculous step before making tier 2 circuits. But that was it. So I enthusiastically consumed the diodes and brown squares to fabricate the tier 2 circuits. Almost immediately I invested them into the third outstandingly indispensable machine, the circuit assembler. Finally, instead of wasting harebrained amounts of resources to craft them manually, the circuit assembler could make both the tier 1 and tier 2 circuits at a ridiculously ludicrous material discount due to robot arm superiority. Gone were the days of the crafting table. With circuits about 2 times cheaper to create, I could now afford to commence the aluminum automation plan, which is rather simple. According to my calculations, aluminum can be obtained simply from cobblestone. But this would need precedented amounts of machines. It would need 3 forge hammers, 1 cobblestone generator, 1 chemical reactor, a fish tank, and a crusher. All of this would be connected together by item and fluid pipes, and connected to this new power grid, since the first one was already being rather overloaded with all its machines. Anyways, the way it works is that cobblestone is crushed multiple times into dust to be soaked in water for clay to be crushed again, to be shuttled into the electrolyzer for infinite aluminum. But this setup isn't just for aluminum. The reason why these item pipes are here is because it allows me to split the outputs to be shared equally into 2 different destinations. This sand would be split to go to this furnace to be cooked into glass. And the glass would be split between 2 new processing lines that turned glass into silicon and oxygen, and turned glass into quartz. The oxygen can then be looped backwards to feed the arc furnace. To understand the increasing mess of pipes and cables, I began watching lore on the stuff I was using, leading to a deeper appreciation of the humble everyday objects we use and the structure of the universe. Anyways, the quartz will be saved for later for a funny object known as the resonant clathrate. And finally, The silicon was collected and dumped into a blast furnace for a shocking 8 minutes, draining a preposterous amount of energy before finally producing the beautiful monocrystalline silicon pool, which exists in real life. In reality, touching the silicon pool leads to immediate contamination and makes it useless, but GregTech decided to not be realistic this time. The real issue was the fact that no machine I currently had was powerful enough to turn my silicon pool into any useful electronics, because I needed medium voltage to process it. Speaking of medium voltage, these low voltage superconductors were barely surviving the fact that the blast furnace is now real, because I had a near disaster during a blasting session, when these wires suddenly looked a tiny bit hot, leading to an emergency shutdown because I didn't want to know what realistic electrical event was about to happen due to GregTech. The moral of the story was that I needed to begin upgrading the electrical systems of the factory to medium voltage equipment to handle the new demands of the factory. And since I now had medium voltage circuits, a growing supply of aluminum, and considerable machinery to process materials, I had everything I needed to take everything to the next tier of gaming, in the next episode. For anyone still confused about how GregTech works, check the description for more information, and how to possibly improve realistic GregTech for more realisticness. And shout out to the channel members from the past.